Welcome to Darkness, Narrator. There are tragedies that remain permanently engraved in national memory, events so powerful that even decades later, people remember exactly where they first heard about them. For Americans, school violence often begins in memory with Columbine High School massacre. It became more than news. It became a dividing line, a moment after which schools no longer felt entirely safe. A moment after which the architecture of education changed. Locked doors, drills, armed officers, cameras, emergency language. But history rarely begins where memory chooses to begin. Because more than 70 years before Columbine, before television networks could broadcast panic live, before helicopters filmed school parking lots, before modern America had words for this kind of violence, a quiet rural town experienced something even deadlier. No gunfire echoed through hallways. No teenagers carrying rifles entered classrooms. Instead, the danger had already been hidden beneath the school itself, buried under the feet of children, installed slowly, piece by piece, by a man who walked through the town without attracting fear, a man who did not shout, who did not announce revenge, who did not appear openly unstable. He simply prepared, and when morning came, he transformed one ordinary school day into the deadliest school attack in American history. The town was Bath. The year was 1927, and almost everything about that morning began in complete normality. That is what makes certain historical crimes so difficult to understand. The silence before them, because nothing in the sound of children arriving at school suggested what already existed beneath the building. Nothing in the weather warned anyone. Nothing in the voices of teachers starting class suggested that within minutes walls would collapse, floors would rupture, and families would begin running toward a scene they would never forget. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the man responsible had spent months living among everyone else as if nothing unusual was happening. His name was Andrew Kehoe, and his anger had become methodical. The rural America. Few remember to understand Bath. It helps to understand rural America in the 1920s. This was not yet the industrial America many imagine. In small farming communities, daily life followed agricultural logic. Morning began early. Animals were fed before sunrise. Children often helped before school. Weather determined income. Machinery broke often and had to be repaired by hand. Money moved slowly. Debt moved faster. People lived close to necessity. A poor harvest could alter an entire year. A damaged tool could become serious expense. Taxes were never abstract in places like Bath. They were personal because every extra payment meant something concrete had to wait. A roof repair delayed, a purchase cancelled, a loan extended. That is why the creation of Bath Consolidated School produced mixed emotions. For many families, it represented educational progress. Instead of scattered small district schools, children would now study in a larger, centralized building, more organized, better equipped, modern for its time. It symbolized ambition, but ambition required funding, and funding meant taxation. For families already under pressure, especially landowners with unstable finances, that became controversial. Public meetings discussed costs, voices rose over assessments, and among those most affected emotionally by these financial disputes was Andrew Kehoe, a man built for silence. Andrew Kehoe remains disturbing partly because his personality resists easy categorization. He was not remembered as chaotic, not remembered as dramatic, not remembered as visibly broken. He was remembered as precise. There are certain people whose silence creates uncertainty because nothing about them openly explains what they are feeling. Kehoe belonged to that category. He handled machinery well. He understood mechanics. Electrical systems interested him. He repaired tools personally. Neighbors knew him as capable, but capability without warmth often leaves people difficult to read. He could appear polite while emotionally distant. He could participate locally while remaining inwardly detached. And over time, several small impressions accumulated around him: stubbornness, resentment, unwillingness to forgive perceived injustice. Financial trouble deepened that psychology. His farm carried mortgage pressure, payments accumulated. He had difficulty maintaining stability. Yet rather than seeing himself inside a larger economic struggle affecting many farmers, he personalized blame. This often happens in historically significant crimes. Hardship becomes narrative. Narrative becomes grievance. Grievance seeks target. For Kehoe, the school increasingly became that target. Not because the school alone caused his problems, but because in his mind it represented institutional pressure made visible. A building funded partly through obligations he resented paying. And because he had served on local boards, he knew its systems intimately. That combination, grievance plus structural familiarity, would become fatal. How mass violence was engineered. Slowly. The modern mind often imagines violent attacks as sudden, but Bath was slow, almost patient. Kehoe purchased explosives gradually. At that time, explosives had legitimate agricultural use. Farmers cleared stumps, managed land, worked difficult soil. So acquisition itself did not immediately signal danger. He understood this. He used ordinary expectations as cover. He also understood the school building. He knew where crawl spaces existed, where access could be gained, where explosives would do maximum structural damage, and this part matters deeply. He did not merely hide explosives, he designed collapse, meaning placement was chosen with purpose. He wired sections beneath the north wing, placed charges along structural points, connected ignition systems carefully, then continued daily life. Imagine the emotional distance required for that, to install explosives beneath classrooms while knowing children would continue studying above them for weeks, to pass through town afterward, to speak normally, to return home, to repeat the process. It required compartmentalization so extreme that ordinary morality had already been abandoned long before detonation. And he did not stop at the school, because his plan involved layered violence. His farm would burn first. Why? Because fire attracts attention. Smoke redirects witnesses. It fragments response. The farm fire was not separate from the school bombing. It was part of the same design. The last night before destruction. Historical records cannot fully recreate emotional atmosphere inside the Kehoe home the night before the attack. But what we do know is that by then, every major decision had already been made. The explosives were placed, the mechanisms prepared, the sequence determined, and somewhere inside that final night, he crossed the last remaining internal boundary. He decided his wife would die too. Nellie Kehoe had health issues and had reportedly been receiving treatment. She had no public role in what was coming, yet she became one more controlled variable in his plan. He killed her before the main attack, then positioned her body among what would later burn. This decision reveals something psychologically important. By the final stage, Kehoe was no longer distinguishing between targets and surroundings. Everything connected to his life became part of total destruction. The farm, the school, the vehicle, the home, the marriage, even his own body. This is often the final architecture of annihilative violence. Nothing remains outside the plan. Morning, the illusion of normal life. Morning arrived quietly. Children prepared for school exactly as always. Breakfasts were ordinary, books carried normally. Teachers entered classrooms expecting routine lessons. No alarm existed because there was no visible reason for alarm. And this may be the darkest feature of many historical disasters. People step into them while still emotionally living inside normality. Some children likely discussed homework. Some likely laughed before class began. Teachers likely organized papers. Outside, fields remained active, and beneath them, wires waited. The morning the school exploded. At approximately 8:45 in the morning, life inside the school still followed the predictable rhythm of an ordinary spring day. Teachers had already begun lessons. Attendance was being taken. Children sat in rows, some focused, some distracted, some looking through classroom windows at the mild Michigan morning outside. The building itself gave no warning. No smell strong enough to raise suspicion. No visible smoke. No sound from beneath the floors. The school had become part of daily life so completely that nobody questioned its safety. That trust would vanish in less than a second. When the explosion came, witnesses later struggled to describe the exact sound because it did not resemble anything they had heard before. It was not simply a blast. It was described as a violent tearing of the earth itself. A sudden pressure wave moved through the north wing of the building, followed immediately by the collapse of brick, timber, plaster, and steel. The floor gave way. Walls cracked outward. Windows shattered in every direction. Entire sections of the north side folded downward with terrifying speed. Inside the classrooms closest to the detonation point, there was no time for reaction. Children were thrown from desks. Heavy beams fell instantly. Masonry crushed rows of seats. Dust exploded into the air so thick that survivors could not immediately see what remained around them. Some children who survived later recalled hearing nothing after the first impact except ringing, as if sound itself had disappeared. Others remembered darkness. Some believed for a few seconds that an earthquake had struck, but earthquakes do not tear a school apart in sections, and within moments, reality became visible. The north wing had partially collapsed into itself. Part of the roof had fallen. Sections of wall were gone entirely. Classrooms had become broken layers of debris and trapped bodies. The first screams came from those still conscious beneath fallen materials. Teachers who survived tried to stand but found themselves trapped under shattered furniture and broken beams. Children crawled where openings existed. Some escaped through spaces created by collapsed walls. Others could not move at all. Outside, the explosion was heard across the farming community. People in nearby fields stopped immediately. Workers looked toward the school and saw dust rising above the building. Parents near enough to recognize the direction understood instantly that something catastrophic had happened, and then they ran. There were no emergency systems like modern towns rely on now, no instant radio dispatch reaching everyone, no organized perimeter, only raw human reaction. People abandoned equipment in fields. Men ran from barns. Women left homes without knowing what they would find. Within minutes, the school grounds filled with ordinary townspeople, arriving before formal rescue teams could even organize. The first sight many encountered remained with them for life. Children covered in dust, wandering in shock, some bleeding heavily, some unable to speak, some screaming names of classmates, teachers calling for help from inside broken sections of wall, parents searching faces in panic before realizing many faces were missing. Dust still floated through the air so thickly that breathing became difficult near the collapsed section. The smell of explosives mixed with broken wood, exposed insulation, brick dust, and blood. Rescue began immediately, but not as a coordinated operation. At first, it was instinct. People climbed rubble with bare hands. Boards were lifted manually. Loose bricks were pulled away piece by piece. Farmers accustomed to physical labor became rescuers instantly. They formed lines. They used whatever tools arrived first: crowbars, shovels, farm equipment. Every second mattered because trapped children could still be heard beneath the debris. Some voices were clear, others became weaker. Teachers trapped under wreckage tried to direct rescuers toward where students had been seated moments earlier. One of the most painful realities was that nobody knew where the safest lifting points were. Every movement risked shifting weight onto someone below, yet hesitation also meant suffocation for those trapped. So decisions were made quickly and emotionally. Men lifted beams that required several people. Women carried injured children away from the rubble and laid them on grass nearby. Blankets appeared from homes. Coats became makeshift pillows. The injured were lined side by side while doctors were summoned from surrounding areas. Some children were so covered in dust that parents could not immediately recognize them. Mothers searched faces desperately. Fathers called names repeatedly. Some survivors emerged carrying injuries they did not yet understand because shock delayed pain. Cuts, fractures, internal injuries. Many remained invisible at first, and while rescue intensified, a terrible realization began spreading. This was not an accident caused by construction failure. Fragments of wiring appeared. Explosive residue became noticeable. Certain adults understood quickly that something deliberate had happened, but even then, nobody knew the attack was not over. Because while the North Wing remained chaos, another figure approached the school grounds. Andrew Kehoe arrived in his truck. To witnesses, his arrival initially did not seem unusual. In small communities, everyone came toward disaster to help. His truck moving toward the school did not immediately trigger suspicion. Some even assumed he had come to assist like everyone else. What few understood was that the vehicle itself had been prepared as the second stage of the attack. Inside were explosives, metal debris, and incendiary materials designed to magnify destruction. He parked near the rescuers. Some witnesses later said he appeared calm, not frantic, not confused, not visibly emotional. That calm would later haunt those who survived, because around him the schoolyard already looked like war. Children were bleeding nearby, bodies were being pulled from rubble, parents were crying openly, and still he remained composed. The school superintendent, Emery Hike, approached. Others moved closer too. Perhaps they expected conversation, perhaps they thought he had information, perhaps nobody could imagine that a second explosion would happen while rescue was underway. Then came the final detonation, The truck exploded with extraordinary violence. Unlike the first blast beneath the school, this explosion happened in open space, sending metal fragments outward like shrapnel. The superintendent was killed. Nearby rescuers were thrown violently. Several people standing close died instantly. Others suffered catastrophic injuries. Glass shattered again across remaining windows. Those already traumatized by the school collapse suddenly faced another impact before they had even understood the first. And in that moment, any lingering doubt disappeared. This was intentional. This was planned. This was murder unfolding in stages. Andrew Kehoe died in the blast he triggered, but even in death, he left confusion behind, because rescuers now had to continue pulling children from rubble, while also processing that the man responsible had just killed more people in front of them. The psychological effect was immediate. People no longer understood what danger remained. Was more explosive hidden elsewhere? Could another section collapse? Were additional devices planted? That uncertainty slowed some rescue efforts briefly, but necessity forced people forward again. Because beneath the rubble, voices still existed, and those voices became the only priority. Hours passed in brutal labor. Heavy equipment from nearby farms was brought in. Teams worked through unstable debris carefully. Some children were found alive after long periods trapped under narrow pockets of air. Those moments created brief hope, but many discoveries brought silence instead. A small shoe under broken wood, a hand visible beneath brick, a desk crushed flat. The emotional burden grew heavier as names became known. Families gathered nearby as lists formed. Survivors were separated from the dead. Temporary treatment areas expanded. Doctors worked continuously. Priests arrived. Community leaders tried to impose order where almost none existed. And then another horrifying discovery emerged. The south wing of the school had not exploded. At first, this seemed like luck, but investigators examining the building soon found that luck had prevented something even worse. Beneath the south wing lay hundreds of additional pounds of explosives that had failed to detonate. Wiring existed there too. Charges had been carefully installed just as in the north wing. Had they ignited successfully, the entire school likely would have collapsed. The death toll could have doubled or worse. That fact changed how survivors understood the day. What happened had already seemed unimaginable, but investigators confirmed that the original plan had intended something even larger. The partial failure of the explosives meant the town had survived only because one part of Kehoe's design malfunctioned. That truth would disturb Bath for generations because it suggested survival itself depended partly on mechanical failure, not prevention, not warning, not intervention, only failed detonation. As bodies continued to be recovered, officials began counting the dead: 38 children, 6 adults, dozens injured, entire families altered permanently. Some parents lost more than one child. Some children lost siblings while surviving themselves. Some teachers never emotionally recovered from what they witnessed in collapsed classrooms. And beyond physical destruction, another transformation had occurred. Bath would never again be simply a rural farming town. It had become part of American tragedy, not because of size, not because of fame, but because history had entered it through violence so deliberate that even decades later, experts still study how one man prepared such destruction unnoticed. By late afternoon, smoke still drifted from the ruins. The farm fire had already revealed another horror there: the body of Nellie Kehoe. And nearby, investigators found a message left by Andrew Kehoe, a sentence written without emotion. A sentence intended to explain everything while explaining almost nothing. Criminals are made, not born. It was not an apology, not a confession, not remorse, only a statement that suggested grievance had fully replaced humanity. Yet even that sentence failed to answer the central question everyone asked. How had a man living among them prepared all of this without anyone truly seeing him? That question would dominate the next stage of the investigation and the hidden months of preparation. By the afternoon of May 18th, the first shock had begun shifting into something colder: investigation. Because grief creates one kind of silence, but deliberate violence creates another. The silence that follows when people begin asking how. Officials arriving in Bath no longer viewed the school as only a rescue site. It had become a crime scene, and unlike many crimes, this one immediately suggested long preparation. The surviving explosives beneath the south wing changed everything investigators believed about the scale of intent. If only the north side had exploded, perhaps the act might still be understood as targeted sabotage, but the untouched explosives beneath the south wing proved total destruction had been planned. Investigators carefully entered remaining crawl spaces beneath the school. There they found additional dynamite, pyrotol charges, and carefully arranged ignition systems. The layout revealed mechanical thought, patience, and repeated access. This had not been improvised, this had taken weeks, possibly months, and because Andrew Kehoe was already dead, investigators had to reconstruct motive entirely through evidence and memory. How often had he entered the school unnoticed? Who had seen him there? What explanations had he given? The answers quickly became unsettling, because many people had seen him near the building before. But in a small town, familiarity erases suspicion. Kehoe had served on the school board. He understood electrical systems. He had legitimate reasons to appear around maintenance areas. What now looked terrifyingly suspicious had once looked ordinary. That is one of the cruelest lessons in retrospective crime analysis. Ordinary behavior becomes sinister only after disaster reveals context. Investigators found that Kehoe had used his technical knowledge carefully. Wiring systems were concealed intelligently. Explosives were distributed for structural effect. Timing mechanisms showed practical understanding rather than random placement. He had not simply hidden bombs, he had engineered collapse. And each discovery made one fact clearer. He had invested extraordinary effort into killing children. That conclusion disturbed even hardened investigators because it contradicted spontaneous rage. This was not sudden fury. This was disciplined intention. Meanwhile, at his farm, the investigation revealed another layer. The remains of Nellie Kehoe confirmed she had been killed before the school attack. Nearby, burned structures showed deliberate ignition patterns. Animals had been left trapped, farm equipment damaged intentionally. It looked less like a home abandoned in panic and more like a final destruction of every piece of his own world. He had chosen not only to attack others, but to erase his own life materially. And as neighbors were questioned, a psychological portrait slowly emerged. Not dramatic madness, not public threats. Instead, resentment, sharp complaints about taxes, repeated anger over school finances, a tendency to blame officials personally. Arguments remembered more clearly now than before. Some neighbors recalled that he often spoke bitterly when discussing money. Others remembered his inability to tolerate contradiction. Yet, nobody had predicted mass murder. That remains one of the enduring difficulties in historical violence analysis. Many warning signs appear significant only after catastrophe gives them shape. At the time, bitterness looked like bitterness. Stubbornness looked like temperament. Financial anger looked common among struggling farmers. But in Andrew Kehoe, those elements had hardened into something lethal. And investigators now faced another question. How had he acquired so much explosive material without intervention? The answer reflected the era. Explosives in agricultural communities were not inherently suspicious. Farm use normalized possession. Purchases spread over time attracted little notice. No modern tracking systems existed. No centralized reporting flagged quantity patterns. He exploited the normality of his environment. Every part of his plan had depended on understanding what people considered ordinary. That made the attack historically significant far beyond Bath itself, because it showed how domestic familiarity can shield preparation for extreme violence. And while investigators mapped evidence, the town entered another unbearable phase: identification, funerals, and public mourning. The dead were no longer numbers, they were names. Children whose desks remained empty forever. And Bath, already broken physically, now entered the emotional reality that would define it for decades. The funerals that stopped an entire town. In small towns, tragedy does not remain abstract for long. In large cities, people can sometimes experience disaster through distance. Numbers appear first, names arrive later. Entire neighborhoods may hear about deaths without personally knowing the victims. But in Bath, distance did not exist. Almost every family knew exactly who had been inside the school that morning. Every child belonged not only to a household, but to a network of relatives, neighbors, church members, classmates, and family friends whose lives overlapped daily. The same roads were shared, the same stores, the same churches, the same harvest seasons. So when the rescue operation ended and the dead were identified, grief did not spread gradually. It struck the entire town at once. And what followed in the days after the explosion became almost as unforgettable as the attack itself. Bath entered a period where daily life nearly stopped because mourning became the only remaining priority. The school no longer stood as a place of routine. Its damaged remains became a symbol people could barely look at directly. Parents who had run toward the rubble now faced a second unbearable task: preparing burials for children who had left home expecting an ordinary day. Many families had no emotional language for what had happened. In 1927, communities like Bath were deeply familiar with hardship. Illness existed without modern treatment. Farming accidents occurred. Winter sometimes took lives. But there was a profound difference between hardship and deliberate destruction. This had not been illness. This had not been weather. This had not been fate in the traditional rural sense. Someone had chosen it. And that knowledge altered grief into something heavier. Funeral homes in the surrounding region were overwhelmed almost immediately. The number of children killed created logistical strain few communities had ever faced. Caskets had to be prepared quickly. Churches coordinated schedules because services could not all happen at once. Families borrowed formal clothing from neighbors when needed. Black garments became visible across the town. Even homes untouched directly by loss often darkened curtains or suspended ordinary activity out of respect. The first funerals began while debris was still being cleared. That overlap intensified the emotional atmosphere because the town had not yet mentally separated rescue from burial. Some families had only just confirmed death when funeral arrangements began. For parents, there was barely time to process before decisions had to be made. Church selection, service order, relatives to notify, burial sites to prepare. And because many families lacked financial flexibility, local support appeared immediately. Neighbors donated money, church groups delivered food, farm work was shared where possible so grieving households would not collapse under practical burden. In rural communities, grief often expresses itself through labor. People repaired fences, delivered wood, handled chores silently because words often failed. But no amount of practical help could soften the image many parents carried. The last morning, the last goodbye, the final ordinary sentence spoken before school. Those memories became central during funeral days. A mother remembering a forgotten lunch, a father remembering a child leaving early, a sibling recalling a small argument now permanently unfinished. The smallest domestic details became emotionally enormous because they marked the final intact moments before catastrophe. Church bells rang repeatedly during those days. Each service drew large attendance because even families without direct loss understood attendance as obligation, solidarity, and survival. In some cases, churches filled beyond capacity. People stood outside. Windows remained open. Voices from sermons drifted into streets where silence dominated. Ministers faced nearly impossible work. How does one explain the death of children in language that grieving parents can endure? Many sermons leaned heavily on faith, divine mystery, and endurance. But beneath those words existed another reality no sermon could erase. Everyone in attendance knew this had not come from mystery. It came from deliberate human planning, and that made spiritual comfort harder to receive. Rows of small caskets created scenes witnesses remembered for decades. Not because they were dramatic in movement, funerals often moved slowly, but because stillness itself became unbearable. Small coffins carry a visual weight unlike any other object in mourning. They force the mind to confront interruption, a future visibly shortened, a classroom permanently reduced, and in Bath there were many. Some families lost one child, others lost siblings. That multiplied grief inside individual homes. A bedroom suddenly half empty, or entirely empty. Toys remaining untouched. Schoolbooks returned with no owner. Clothing folded but never worn again. For surviving brothers and sisters, the days after the funerals introduced another difficult reality. They remained alive in a town where childhood itself no longer felt ordinary. Many children who survived the explosion had attended funerals for classmates before fully understanding their own trauma. Some had visible injuries, bandages, burns, broken bones. Others had no major physical wounds, but carried shock that adults of the time often could not fully name. Modern trauma language did not exist in the same way then. Children who stopped speaking for days were often described simply as shaken. Nightmares were rarely treated clinically. Yet survivors later described long-lasting fear of enclosed buildings, sudden sounds, and school environments. During funeral days, those children often stood near grieving adults, while still trying to understand why desks beside theirs would never be filled again. Outside churches, conversations often returned to the same impossible sentence. How could Andrew Kehoe have done this? Because funerals force communities not only to mourn but to narrate. People repeat facts because facts are easier than accepting emotional scale. He planted explosives. He killed his wife. He burned the farm. He came back. He detonated again. The repetition became part of mourning because no simpler explanation existed, and each retelling deepened horror rather than reducing it. Another striking feature of those funeral days was how quickly national attention arrived, but how differently it moved compared to modern disasters. Newspapers from across the United States covered the tragedy. Reporters entered Bath seeking interviews, details, photographs. Yet for residents, media attention often felt secondary because local grief remained too immediate to perform publicly. Parents were not thinking historically. They were choosing burial clothes. They were identifying personal belongings. They were facing bedrooms at night that no longer contained movement. Some reporters described Bath as unnaturally quiet. That silence was real, because when many funerals happen close together, towns change acoustically. Less laughter, less ordinary conversation, less movement. Even animals seem louder because human sound withdraws. Farm routines resumed only partially. Fields still required care, but many tasks slowed. People worked because crops could not wait, yet emotional focus remained elsewhere. Even adults who had not lost family often described inability to think normally for weeks. Every road passed reminders. Every conversation returned to names. The cemetery became central to community life in those days. Repeated processions, fresh soil, flowers accumulating faster than usual. Children buried near each other because families often chose proximity. The visual effect of so many recent graves in one period deeply affected residents. It made tragedy visible beyond newspaper headlines, and unlike large national disasters where memorialization becomes formal quickly, Bath first memorialized through repetition of grief itself. People remembered which day each family buried which child, who collapsed during service, which church overflowed, which parent could not speak. Those memories remained local history before monuments ever existed. For teachers who survived, funerals carried another emotional burden. They often attended services while blaming themselves privately, even when blame was irrational. Teachers remembered classroom positions, who sat where, which students they reached, which voices they heard beneath rubble. Many carried lifelong questions about seconds they could never recover. Could one movement have changed survival? Could one warning have mattered? These are common survivor questions after structural violence, and Bath produced many of them. Some teachers reportedly struggled for years returning to educational spaces because funerals had frozen the image of students not as future adults, but as unfinished children. Even officials from outside Bath recognized the extraordinary scale of mourning, because 38 children in one small town meant grief touched nearly every social structure simultaneously. Schools, churches, farms, civic meetings, family gatherings. No area remained untouched. And while funerals continued, investigators kept revealing more details, especially the horrifying fact that far more explosives had failed to detonate beneath the south wing. That revelation reached grieving families while funerals were still happening, meaning some parents were forced to hear that what had happened could have been even worse, that many more caskets might have existed, that mechanical failure, not prevention, had limited total destruction. For some, that fact offered bitter relief. For others, it created deeper rage, because it confirmed total intent. Andrew Kehoe had not acted in partial anger. He had aimed for full annihilation. As the final funerals concluded, Bath entered another phase, not immediate mourning but altered identity, because once a town buries that many children, it no longer returns fully to what it was before. Roads remain the same, fields remain, buildings may be repaired, but emotional geography changes permanently. And in Bath, every future school morning would carry memory of one spring day when parents sent children to class and many never came home. Who Andrew Kehoe really was before the bombing, after the funerals, after the rubble had been studied, after the names of the dead had already spread beyond Michigan, one question remained impossible to ignore. Who exactly had Andrew Kehoe been before the bombing? Because mass violence often creates a disturbing contradiction. The person responsible becomes widely known only after the crime, while those who lived beside that person begin searching backward through ordinary memories, trying to locate signs that once seemed too small to matter. In Bath, many residents had known Kehoe for years, not intimately in every case, but enough to form impressions, enough to exchange greetings, enough to attend meetings with him, enough to observe habits. And what emerged from those recollections was not the image of a man constantly shouting threats or behaving in ways that would have clearly predicted catastrophe. Instead, the portrait that developed was more unsettling precisely because it looked controlled. He was often described as intelligent, practical, mechanically skilled, capable of repairing equipment without assistance, a man who understood systems. That mattered because the bombing itself reflected the same traits. The explosives had not been arranged carelessly. The ignition system beneath the school showed patience and technical understanding. This was not random destruction created by impulse. It reflected a mind comfortable with precision. Kehoe had been born in the late 19th century, a period when rural American life demanded discipline from an early age. Families worked hard because survival required it. Physical labor was not exceptional. It was expected. Children learned quickly that usefulness mattered. That environment often shaped strong personalities, but in Kehoe's case, many later believed it may also have reinforced emotional hardness already present in him. Accounts from earlier years suggested he could be cold even before Bath. Not openly violent in ordinary public settings, but emotionally severe. There were stories, repeated often after the bombing, about how little patience he showed when frustrated. One of the most repeated accounts involved a farm animal that had failed to perform as expected. Rather than tolerate delay or difficulty, he reportedly reacted with extreme anger. Whether every detail of those stories remained perfectly accurate became difficult to verify because memory changes after catastrophe, but the pattern mattered. Many recollections emphasized disproportionate hostility when control was interrupted, and control appears repeatedly in understanding Kehoe. He did not tolerate loss of control easily. Financial pressure became unbearable, partly because debt places power elsewhere. Taxes represent obligation imposed externally. Mortgage payments represent vulnerability. Public decisions about school funding represented something even more personal to him, the feeling that his own labor was being consumed by systems he could not fully command. To many others in Bath, taxes were difficult but necessary. To Kehoe, they increasingly became proof that he was being wronged. This distinction is critical because two people can experience the same hardship and construct entirely different meanings from it. For one person, hardship becomes temporary burden. For another, it becomes evidence of persecution. Kehoe appears to have chosen the second path. And once grievance becomes identity, ordinary frustrations begin accumulating with unusual force. Neighbors later recalled how intensely he reacted during conversations involving money. He did not simply complain, he seemed to fix blame, specific blame. School taxes became central in his language because the school represented visible authority. A physical building connected to recurring payments he resented. That resentment deepened when his own financial situation worsened. His farm struggled, mortgage pressure increased. Agricultural economics in the 1920s were already difficult for many farmers across the United States, but not every struggling farmer became consumed by vengeance. That is where personality matters. Kehoe did not seem to process hardship communally. He processed it privately and increasingly bitterly. Even his participation in civic roles revealed this contradiction. He served on the local school board, which meant he was not excluded from decision-making. He had direct involvement. He understood the school's finances better than many residents. Yet rather than reducing resentment, that involvement may have intensified it because he saw details constantly. Every budget discussion became another reminder of obligations he disliked. And there is another important psychological feature visible here. He remained functional while internally escalating. This often makes dangerous individuals difficult to identify. He did not withdraw completely from society. He did not abandon routine. He attended meetings, maintained appearances, handled farm responsibilities, spoke when necessary. People often expect catastrophic intent to appear dramatic before violence occurs, but many historically significant offenders remain externally ordinary while internally building narratives no one else fully hears. His marriage to Nellie Kehoe also raises difficult questions. She had health problems and required treatment, which created additional financial burden. Medical costs in that era could quietly intensify household pressure, especially in rural communities. Yet there is little evidence that neighbors saw dramatic domestic conflict publicly. Again, this pattern returns: outward normality, inward hardening. And when he eventually killed Nellie before the bombing, investigators saw that act not only as murder, but as evidence that by the final stage, every personal relationship had become secondary to his destructive plan. It is deeply significant that he did not leave her behind alive. That decision suggests he no longer imagined any future in which parts of his world continued independently after his death. Everything had to be included in the collapse. There are also repeated descriptions of his emotional style during disagreements. He could become rigid rather than explosive. That rigidity matters because it aligns with how the bombing was prepared. A man who shouts may release anger quickly. A man who hardens silently may carry it longer. Kehoe appears to have belonged to the second category. Months of preparation required silence more than rage. He had to maintain ordinary behavior while hiding extraordinary intent. He had to purchase explosives without drawing concern. He had to enter the school repeatedly without changing routine enough to alarm anyone. He had to build two separate phases of attack: school detonation and truck explosion. That level of planning required compartmentalization so severe that emotion became subordinate to process. And perhaps that is why many later descriptions of him used words like cold, not wild. Because coldness explains duration. Wild anger burns quickly. Cold anger organizes. There were also earlier incidents that later seemed more meaningful. Some residents remembered his hostility toward animals. Others recalled how sharply he reacted when machinery failed. Mechanical breakdowns angered him disproportionately because machines, unlike people, are expected to obey exact function. When they fail, control is interrupted. That detail becomes psychologically revealing because the bombing itself depended on forcing destruction through mechanical certainty. He trusted systems more than human unpredictability. He placed explosives because explosives obey timing. He used wiring because wiring does not argue. He relied on structure because structure can be calculated. Yet even within that calculation, fate intervened. The South Wing charges failed. That failure became one of the few barriers between tragedy and something even larger. Another chilling element emerged after his death: the message found on his property. Criminals are made, not born. The sentence remains famous because it sounds almost philosophical while revealing almost nothing emotionally human. No apology, no names, no mention of children, no explanation of why specific victims deserved death, only abstraction. That too fits his psychological pattern. He framed himself not as murderer, but as product, as if responsibility had shifted outward, as if circumstances had manufactured him. This is common in violent offenders whose grievance has become moral justification. They no longer experience themselves primarily as choosing evil. They experience themselves as responding inevitably to injustice. And once that internal belief forms strongly enough, mass violence becomes imaginable. Yet the deeper tragedy remains this: many people in Bath had seen him recently before the attack and noticed nothing that morning that suggested what was about to happen. No visible breakdown, no public confession, no warning dramatic enough to stop him. He moved through his final hours as someone carrying secret completion. And perhaps that is why history continues returning to Andrew Kehoe, not because he was loud, but because he was silent until destruction spoke for him. His personality did not announce catastrophe, it concealed it, and that concealment became one of the most haunting parts of the entire Bath tragedy. Because even after investigators understood what he had done, many still struggled to answer the most unsettling question: how long had he already emotionally crossed the line before anyone knew he had crossed it? The survivors who never forgot that morning. For those who died in Bath school disaster, history stopped on the morning of May 18, 1927. But for those who survived, history did something more difficult. It continued, and continuation, after a catastrophe like Bath, often became its own burden. Because surviving did not mean returning to normal life. It meant carrying sounds, images, and unfinished memories into adulthood, often for decades. Many of the children who escaped the collapse were too young at the time to fully understand what had happened politically or psychologically. They did not know about taxation disputes. They did not understand why Andrew Kehoe had targeted the school. What they understood first was noise. The sound itself became one of the most repeated memories among survivors, later in life. Some described it as thunder exploding inside the room. Others said it felt like the building had jumped beneath them before collapsing downward. Several survivors recalled that for the first few seconds after the blast, hearing almost disappeared. A powerful ringing replaced ordinary sound, making voices seem distant or unreal. That moment of sensory confusion became the dividing line many never forgot. 1 second classroom routine, the next second complete disorientation. Some children remembered seeing desks rise. Others remembered being thrown sideways before even understanding they were falling. One former student later described how light disappeared instantly because dust filled the room so completely that daylight became grey darkness. The north wing collapse created an environment where orientation vanished. Children did not know where doors had been. Walls no longer looked like walls. Floors no longer remained level. Some found themselves pinned beneath wood and plaster, before realizing other classmates nearby had stopped moving entirely. For those trapped but conscious, time changed immediately. Minutes felt endless because every sound suggested uncertainty. Would more debris fall? Would someone reach them? Was the building still collapsing? Children called out names. Sometimes classmates answered. Sometimes no answer came. One of the most haunting survivor patterns seen in later interviews involved memory fragments rather than continuous recollection. This is common after severe trauma. A child remembers one shoe nearby, a teacher's hand under dust, a scream from another room, a shaft of light through broken boards, then nothing until being lifted outside. Some survivors could never reconstruct exact sequence because the brain preserved fragments instead of chronology. Others remembered one precise emotional moment more than physical pain, realizing adults outside were calling names and hearing names that no longer received answers. For many, that was the first moment they understood that classmates had died. Some children escaped through openings created by collapsed brick. They crawled toward daylight without fully understanding where they were moving. One survivor later recalled seeing the outside sky through what had once been part of a classroom wall, and not understanding why the room suddenly had open air where brick should have been. Another remembered trying to stand and discovering the floor beneath one leg no longer existed. Teachers played an enormous role in survival during those first minutes. Several injured teachers continued directing children despite wounds. Some called out instructions from beneath debris. Some physically shielded students during collapse. For survivors, those voices often became permanent memories because they represented the last order inside total chaos. A teacher saying, "Stay still," a teacher calling names, a teacher asking if anyone could move. These ordinary educational voices suddenly became survival voices, and then came the rescue. For many children, being pulled from rubble became the second unforgettable moment. Hands appeared through dust, adult voices from above, light widening slowly as debris moved. Some survivors later remembered fear when beams shifted, because each movement suggested another collapse might follow. Others remembered pain arriving only after they reached open air. Shock had hidden injuries temporarily. Outside, the emotional scene often became more difficult than the collapse itself. Children emerged into a schoolyard transformed into an emergency ground, parents crying, bodies covered nearby, adults shouting for doctors. Some survivors recognized classmates lying still on blankets before anyone explained what that meant, and because children often process visually before verbally, many understood death through stillness long before adults tried to protect them from it. Several survivors later said the silence of certain classmates disturbed them more than visible injuries. A child who never moved, a desk partner who no longer answered. That silence followed them for years. The second explosion, the truck bomb detonated by Kehoe during rescue, intensified trauma further for those still near the building. Imagine surviving the first collapse, believing rescue has begun, then hearing another violent blast. Some children thought the school was exploding again. Others believed a second building had fallen. Adults already carrying injured children were thrown into renewed panic. That second detonation permanently reinforced one psychological lesson for survivors. Danger had no clear end that morning. Even rescue contained violence. And because trauma formed in layers, many survivors later described Bath not as one event, but as multiple shocks compressed into a single morning. Explosion, collapse, dust, bodies, rescue, second explosion, fire, names being called, funerals afterward. Each stage became attached to the others. Returning to education after Bath proved emotionally difficult. A temporary school arrangement had to be created because the original building was destroyed. But for children who returned, school itself no longer meant innocence. Every creaking sound carried new meaning. Some reportedly reacted strongly to noises beneath floors or sudden mechanical sounds nearby. If a door slammed unexpectedly, fear returned instantly. What modern psychology now identifies clearly as trauma often remained unnamed then. Children were expected to continue. Adults believed routine could restore stability, and to some degree, routine helped. But many survivors later admitted that normality never fully returned. Certain memories simply learned to live quietly beneath ordinary adulthood. Some survivors became adults who avoided discussing Bath for years, not because memory faded, but because speaking reopened sensory detail too vividly. Others became willing later in life to describe specific moments when historians and journalists returned to document the disaster decades afterward. These later testimonies became historically important because they revealed how deeply childhood trauma had remained preserved. One survivor, speaking many years later, still described the smell of dust as if it were recent. Another remembered seeing sunlight through floating debris and associating that exact visual image with fear for the rest of life. These details matter because they show how trauma stores itself physically, not only as story, as sensation, as sound, as smell, as angle of light. Even adulthood did not erase survivor guilt in some cases. Children who escaped certain desks later wondered why they survived while friends seated nearby died. This question often emerged later, once they were old enough to understand probability. A small seat difference, a beam falling slightly differently, a pocket of air forming in one place but not another. Life and death had often depended on inches. That realization can become emotionally heavy only years later, when childhood understanding matures. Some survivors also carried a complicated relationship with Andrew Kehoe's name. As children, they knew only that a man had done this. As adults, they understood the deliberate planning behind it. And for many, that knowledge deepened horror rather than resolving it, because spontaneous disaster can sometimes be emotionally accepted more easily than patient cruelty. Bath was patient cruelty. Months hidden beneath a school, months while children attended class above explosives. That fact haunted survivors because it suggested danger had existed invisibly long before anyone heard the blast. And perhaps one of the most painful survivor realities was attending funerals immediately after surviving. Children with injuries attended services for classmates before fully recovering physically or emotionally. The classroom community did not simply shrink abstractly. It vanished visibly. Desks remained empty forever. Names disappeared from attendance permanently. That visual absence may have shaped memory even more than the explosion itself. Because explosions happen in seconds, absence repeats for years. Every new school day became reminder. Every graduation later carried invisible names of those who never reached it. Even survivors who moved away carried Bath with them. Many later said that although towns changed and decades passed, one spring morning in Michigan remained emotionally present beneath all later life events. Marriage, children, work, retirement, still Bath remained. Because some events do not stay in the past as completed history, they remain structurally inside identity. And that may explain why even decades later, elderly survivors still paused when describing the first sound they heard before the building came down. Not because memory had weakened, but because memory had never fully left. Why America slowly forgot Bath. When people speak today about school violence in the United States, one name almost always appears first: Columbine High School Massacre. For many Americans, Columbine became the symbolic beginning of a new era. It was broadcast repeatedly. Its images entered television history. Its names became permanently associated with national fear. After Columbine, nearly every later school tragedy was compared to it. And yet long before Columbine, long before modern live news cycles, before helicopters circled school buildings, before cell phone footage captured panic in real time, the deadliest school attack in American history had already happened. It happened in Bath. It killed more children than many modern attacks combined. It involved months of planning. It used explosives hidden beneath classrooms. It destroyed part of a school and shattered an entire town. And still, for much of the country today, Bath remains unfamiliar. This raises an unsettling historical question. How can an event so catastrophic slowly disappear from national memory? Part of the answer begins with time itself. The Bath disaster happened in 1927 in an America that communicated tragedy differently. News existed, but its movement had limits. Newspapers carried the story nationally, and for several days, the attack shocked readers across the country. Front pages described the horror. Photographs circulated. Journalists arrived, the nation reacted. But reaction in 1927 moved through print, not repetition. A newspaper could shock a nation in one morning, yet by the following week, another story could replace it entirely. There were no continuous television broadcasts replaying footage for days, no archival clips shown every anniversary, no digital platforms pushing remembrance each year, no endless rediscovery through social media. Once newspaper attention moved forward, memory began depending largely on institutions, schools, historians, local communities, and later books. And Bath existed in a rural town without national political machinery built around memory. Another reason Bath faded is that its visual record remained limited. Modern tragedies often remain alive because people can picture them immediately. They remember hallway footage, police vehicles, crying students, live interviews. Bath had photographs, but photographs from 1927 lacked the emotional immediacy of moving image. Static black and white images documented destruction, but they did not create the same permanent broadcast memory later generations experienced with television-era tragedies. Without repeated visual exposure, public memory weakens faster. But there is another reason even more powerful. The story itself did not fit later national narratives in the same way modern school violence did. Columbine became culturally central, partly because it reflected fears tied to modern youth, social alienation, guns, media, and suburban safety. It happened inside a late 20th century America, already shaped by television psychology. Bath belonged to a different emotional world. Its attacker was not a student, not a teenager, not someone inside youth culture. Andrew Kehoe was an adult farmer, a taxpayer, a local official, a man connected to financial resentment and explosives. That made the event harder to fit into later simplified discussions of school violence. It was a school attack, but not in the modern form most people imagine. So when later generations built cultural memory around school violence, Bath often remained outside the first examples people recalled. Even language contributed to forgetting. Many later Americans heard the phrase school shooting far more often than school bombing. And because Bath involved explosives rather than firearms, it became separated mentally from modern categories, even though the victims were schoolchildren all the same. Historical categorization often shapes memory more than raw death toll. Another reason Bath faded lies in geography. Small towns often preserve memory locally while losing national visibility. Inside Michigan history, Bath remained deeply important. Locally, names survived. Memorials remained meaningful. Families passed stories forward. The site itself carried memory, but national memory depends on repeated cultural transmission, and Bath did not receive that repetition often enough. There were anniversaries, yes, historical articles, yes, but not constant reintegration into mainstream American consciousness. Then came the 20th century itself, a century so crowded with catastrophe that older tragedies were repeatedly pushed deeper into the archive. The Great Depression arrived only 2 years later and transformed national priorities completely. Soon after came major crime waves, political upheaval, war mobilization, and eventually World War II. In such a century, many tragedies that once dominated headlines became historically overshadowed. Bath did not vanish because it lacked significance. It vanished because history kept generating newer disasters, demanding immediate emotional space. And unlike national assassinations or wars, Bath had no annual political ritual attached to it, no president referencing it regularly, no educational requirement ensuring every student learned its details, no major film that permanently reintroduced it to each generation. Historical survival often depends not only on importance, but on retelling, and Bath was not retold enough. There is also an uncomfortable psychological reason societies sometimes forget events like Bath. It happened too early to fit reassuring narratives. Many people unconsciously imagine extreme school violence as a modern problem created by recent cultural collapse. Bath disrupts that belief completely. Because in 1927, in a rural farming town often imagined as socially stable, disciplined, and morally simpler, one man still spent months planning mass murder beneath classrooms. That truth challenges nostalgia. It suggests that human grievance capable of targeting children existed long before modern explanations, long before internet culture, long before television, long before modern suburban alienation. For some historical narratives, that is inconvenient. So Bath remains less discussed than events that fit cleaner modern arguments. And yet historians who return to Bath often describe the same reaction, surprise at how little the average American knows about it. Because when one studies the details, the scale feels impossible to ignore. 38 children killed, 6 adults dead, additional explosives that nearly doubled the destruction, a second truck explosion during rescue, a wife murdered before dawn, a farm burned intentionally. Few events combine so many layers of calculated violence in one morning. Still, outside historical circles, many hear of Bath for the first time only when searching forgotten American tragedies. Even comparisons with Columbine reveal how differently memory operates. Columbine remains emotionally present because survivors entered television culture, interviews repeated, books multiplied, policy debates expanded nationally for years. Bath survivors existed largely before mass media memorial culture matured. Their testimonies remained powerful, but less nationally amplified, and as decades passed, living witnesses naturally became fewer. With each passing generation, events survive only if institutions actively preserve them. Bath has been preserved, but often quietly. The memorial at the site remains. Historians continue writing. Michigan remembers. Yet national memory still treats Bath almost like a hidden chapter, perhaps because hidden chapters require effort, while famous tragedies arrive already familiar. But there is irony in that forgetting. Because every time America debates school safety, one of the earliest and deadliest warnings sits nearly a century in the past, waiting to be remembered. Bath was not simply an isolated old crime. It was an early lesson in how private grievance can become public devastation, a lesson written before modern America had language for such events. And perhaps that is exactly why remembering Bath matters now, because forgetting can create the illusion that history began later than it truly did, when in reality, on one spring morning in Michigan, history had already shown exactly how devastating a single determined individual could become, how close Bath came to becoming even worse. For many years after the disaster in Bath, the number most often repeated was 38. 38 children killed, 6 adults dead, dozens injured. It was already enough to make the attack the deadliest school massacre in American history, but investigators discovered something that made the event even more chilling. The final death toll had not reflected the full plan. Because what happened that morning was not the complete version of what Andrew Kehoe intended. It was only the portion that successfully detonated, and that distinction changed how officials understood everything. When investigators first entered the damaged remains of the school, after rescue operations slowed, they were no longer looking only for structural explanations. They were looking for cause. Wires had already been seen near the collapsed north wing. Fragments of explosive material had been identified. It quickly became obvious that the north side had not failed naturally. But as search teams moved deeper beneath surviving sections of the building, they found something even more disturbing. Beneath the south wing, where children had also attended class that morning, additional explosives remained hidden. Not a small amount, not leftover fragments, hundreds of pounds, carefully positioned, connected through wiring systems similar to those that had already destroyed the north wing. This meant the attack had been designed to hit far more than one section of the building. Kehoe had not intended partial collapse. He had intended near total destruction. The south wing charges had simply failed to ignite. That failure became one of the most significant accidental interruptions in American tragedy. Because if those explosives had detonated exactly as planned, the school would likely have collapsed across both major sections. The number of trapped children would have multiplied immediately. Teachers who survived in one area might never have escaped. Rescue itself would have become nearly impossible in the first critical minutes, because destruction would have covered far more ground. The emotional impact of this discovery on the town was enormous. Families already burying children now learned that many more deaths had been prevented, only because a mechanical sequence failed. No warning had stopped him. No one had discovered the explosives in time. No authority had interrupted the attack. The difference between the actual death toll and an even larger massacre came down to malfunction. That fact unsettled investigators because it suggested the town had survived not through prevention, but through imperfection in Kehoe's own system. And Andrew Kehoe understood systems extremely well. That made the failure even more important to study, because if a man known for mechanical precision still experienced ignition failure, investigators wanted to understand why. The explosives under the school included dynamite and pyritol, both materials available for legitimate agricultural purposes during that era. Pyritol, in particular, had become relatively accessible after military surplus from earlier wartime production entered civilian use. For farmers, such materials were not automatically suspicious. They could be used for clearing land, removing stumps, breaking difficult ground. Kehoe understood this normality and used it as cover. He purchased materials gradually enough that no single acquisition appeared alarming. Once inside the school, he distributed them beneath structural points where pressure would create maximum collapse. The north wing showed exactly how effective that planning had been. The south wing showed what nearly followed. Investigators examining the unexploded charges found that wiring had been laid carefully. This was not abandoned work, not incomplete preparation. The system had been built to function, but one connection failed. Some reports suggested a short circuit or interruption in ignition sequence prevented full detonation. Others indicated that one part of the timer mechanism may not have transferred ignition properly through the entire chain. Whatever the exact technical failure, the result was extraordinary. Hundreds of pounds remained silent while one side of the school exploded. That silence preserved many lives. And because survivors did not know this during the attack, the revelation came later with enormous psychological weight. Imagine surviving one classroom collapse, then learning days later that another set of explosives had existed directly beneath additional children. It changed memory itself. For some survivors, the event became not only what happened, but what almost happened. This is often psychologically difficult after mass tragedy, because people begin imagining alternate versions. A desk placed differently, a classroom scheduled elsewhere, a few more functioning wires, a few more seconds. Bath residents began realizing that their already catastrophic morning had existed only inches away from something larger. Investigators also examined whether the second truck explosion had been intended partly as backup in case school destruction proved incomplete. The truck bomb, detonated while rescuers were already working, suggested Kehoe had built layers into the attack. If the school did not kill enough, the truck added more death. That layered design reinforced one disturbing conclusion. He had anticipated movement, response, and timing. This was not merely anger expressed through one blast. It was staged violence, farm fire, school detonation, truck explosion, each stage overlapping. And because the south wing failed, the truck explosion became even more central to his final destructive sequence. Had the south wing exploded successfully, however, rescue conditions would have changed drastically. There might have been far fewer rescuers standing in one concentrated area when he arrived, or there might have been even greater crowd density because more sections required immediate digging. Either possibility suggests that total deaths could have expanded dramatically. Some historians later argued that if every explosive component had worked exactly as intended, the number of dead might have doubled. Others believe it could have gone beyond that, depending on classroom occupancy and collapse pattern. No estimate removes uncertainty because building collapse behaves unpredictably, but every estimate agrees on one point. Bath could have become far deadlier than the number history already records. The south wing itself became almost symbolic in later historical writing, because one intact section of school represented a silent mechanical failure standing between disaster and catastrophe on an even larger scale. Children who had attended classes above unexploded charges often learned years later exactly how close they had been. For them, survival gained another dimension. They had not merely survived the attack, they had survived the failure of part of the plan. That difference can change how memory feels. It means death had already been placed beneath them, but had simply not completed its path. Investigators removing the unexploded materials worked carefully, because even after the bombing, danger remained active. The charges still required safe handling. The idea that children had sat above that material for weeks, perhaps months, became one of the most haunting elements of the entire case, because it revealed how invisible danger had been. Every ordinary school morning before May 18th had already existed above hidden mass death. Students had learned arithmetic, read lessons, spoken with teachers, walked hallways, all while explosives waited below. That hidden duration disturbed later historians even more than the moment of explosion itself. Violence that hides beneath routine for months creates a different kind of horror than sudden attack. It means normal life had unknowingly coexisted with preparation for catastrophe. And because Kehoe remained part of the community while building this, trust itself became one of the casualties. Bath no longer viewed ordinary familiarity the same way afterward. The fact that one man had moved so calmly while creating something so large changed how people interpreted quietness, not only in Bath but in later historical analysis nationwide. Today, when experts revisit Bath, they often focus not only on what exploded, but on what failed, because failure prevented the full mathematical reality of Kehoe's intent. And perhaps that is the darkest technical truth in the entire story. The deadliest school attack in American history is also remembered as a massacre that mechanically stopped before reaching its full design. Not because mercy appeared, not because remorse intervened, only because wires, timing, or ignition failed where hatred had not. The school built after the horror. In the hours after the explosion at Bath School disaster, the center of Bath no longer looked like a functioning town. Dust still floated in the air. Wood splinters covered the ground. Broken bricks lay across roads and fields. Parents moved through debris, calling names that no one answered. Teachers who had survived sat nearby, injured, unable to speak clearly. The school, the place where ordinary routine had existed only minutes before, had become a ruin. And beneath that ruin, rescue workers still searched for children. For Bath, the first emotional reality was simple. The town had not only lost people, it had lost the building that held daily life together. Because in a small, rural community, a school was more than classrooms. It was structure, it was rhythm. It was where nearly every family crossed paths every week, where meetings happened, where announcements spread, where children moved through the same doors year after year. Its destruction meant that even if grief could somehow be managed, practical life had also collapsed. And yet, almost immediately, even while funerals were still being planned, one question appeared. Where would the surviving children go now? That question felt unbearable to many families. Some parents could not imagine sending their children back into any classroom at all. The idea of walls, desks, bells, and lessons suddenly carried fear. For children who survived, school no longer meant routine. It meant sound, collapse, dust, screaming. Many had seen classmates disappear under debris. Some had watched teachers bleeding. Others had been pulled from rubble by neighbors they knew personally. Now adults were asking them to return to education, as though education itself had not just become associated with death. This created one of the quietest but most important parts of the aftermath. Bath had to rebuild emotionally before it rebuilt physically. Temporary arrangements came first. Churches opened space. Community buildings were used. Any structure capable of holding desks became part of emergency education. Lessons resumed not because grief had passed, but because people understood something essential. Routine was necessary for survival. If children remained suspended entirely inside mourning, fear could become permanent. Teachers understood this deeply, even while many were grieving their own colleagues and students. Some instructors returned, while still emotionally shattered. Some entered temporary classrooms knowing certain names would never answer attendance again. That first return to learning was not normal education. It was grief management disguised as ordinary structure. Children entered rooms carrying silence with them. Some sat near exits. Some reacted to sudden noises. Some looked repeatedly toward windows whenever outside movement appeared. Adults noticed immediately that the attack had changed behavior. Concentration was difficult. Trust felt fragile. And because the attacker had been someone from the town itself, fear no longer felt distant. It had come from within familiar life. That made recovery slower. At the same time, public support arrived from outside Bath. Donations came from across Michigan and beyond. Money, supplies, construction support, and messages from strangers began reaching the town. The disaster had shocked the country enough that many wanted Bath rebuilt quickly, not only because children needed classrooms, but because rebuilding became symbolic. Destroying the school had been an attempt to wound the future of the town. Rebuilding it became refusal. The new structure would not erase grief, but it would deny permanence to destruction. That idea mattered deeply to local leaders. Plans developed for a replacement school near the damaged site. But every decision carried emotional difficulty. Where exactly should the new building stand? How close to the destroyed ground was acceptable? Would children accept entering a school too near the place where classmates died? Would parents? Even practical architecture became psychological. Walls were no longer only walls. They represented whether safety could be believed again. Eventually, a new school emerged through determined community effort. It became known as a sign that Bath had chosen continuity instead of surrender. But no rebuilt structure could erase memory from location. The ground itself still carried names. Every child returning understood that another school had stood before this one. Teachers knew which students should have been older now. Parents driving past still remembered where they stood that morning when smoke rose. Reconstruction therefore became layered, physically new, emotionally haunted. For surviving children, the first years inside a rebuilt educational environment remained difficult. Some survivors later described hearing ordinary school sounds differently forever. A dropped object, a slammed door, a sharp mechanical noise. All could briefly pull the mind backward. Trauma in children often hides inside reactions adults notice only later. A teacher might see a student freeze for a moment and not immediately understand why, but Bath teachers understood more than most. They had lived through the same morning. This shared survival created a strange educational environment. Many adults teaching were also victims. That meant classrooms carried invisible mutual recognition. Teacher and student often both remembered exactly where they had been when the blast came. In later years, memorial thinking also began shaping the site. The town understood quickly that rebuilding alone was not enough. The dead needed visible remembrance. Because without remembrance, reconstruction could appear like replacement. And nothing about Bath could truly replace what had been lost. Memorial markers became essential. Names mattered, especially the names of children, because children are often remembered differently in public tragedy. Their futures become part of the grief, not only who they were, but who they never became. The memorial space near the school gradually carried this emotional role. Visitors came not only to see history, but to confront scale. The fact that so many children had died in one morning made the site feel different from ordinary historical ground. It felt unfinished in emotional terms. Even decades later, people arriving there often described silence as the first noticeable thing, not because the town itself lacked sound, but because memory changes how silence feels. The rebuilt school therefore existed beside permanent absence. Students in later generations grew up learning why the town carried unusual historical attention. Teachers taught local history not as distant fact, but as inherited memory. Children born decades later still knew names from 1927. That continuity mattered because it prevented total disappearance. While the nation gradually forgot much of Bath, Bath itself did not. The town preserved what larger memory often neglected. And perhaps one of the strongest signs of resilience came from something simple. Children kept returning to school. Every generation after 1927 entered classrooms despite knowing what had once happened there. That repeated return became quiet resistance against fear, because education continued exactly where destruction had tried to make continuation impossible. Yet even as life resumed, survivors carried a particular kind of grief few outsiders fully understood. They had survived a place designed to kill them. That awareness often stays hidden in adulthood. Some survivors later spoke little about it publicly. Others spoke only when historians asked decades later. But whether spoken or not, the rebuilt school stood as evidence that survival had required more than construction. It required ordinary courage repeated daily. A child walking into class again, a parent saying goodbye at the door again, a teacher closing a classroom door without panic again. These acts appear small from outside. Inside Bath, they were enormous, because every ordinary act occurred after extraordinary betrayal. And that is why the rebuilt school matters historically. Not simply because it replaced bricks, but because it restored a rhythm that violence had tried to permanently destroy. A school is usually remembered for what children learn inside it. Bath's rebuilt school became remembered also for what the town learned around it. That grief does not end when walls rise, but walls rising anyway can still mean something powerful. The last message left behind. By the time the explosions were over in Bath, by the time the smoke had begun to settle, by the time rescuers had stopped hearing new voices beneath the rubble, one final detail emerged from the property of Andrew Kehoe that would remain attached to the crime forever. It was not another explosive, not another weapon, not another hidden mechanism. It was a message simple enough to fit on a sign, and yet powerful enough to survive nearly a century in the memory of everyone who studies the case. Investigators moving through the remains of Kehoe's farm found a board placed where it could easily be seen. Written clearly across it were the words, "Criminals are made, not born." That sentence became the final voice he left behind. No apology, no explanation in detail, no names, no confession written in sorrow. Just a statement, cold, deliberate, almost philosophical in tone. And because it was the only message he intentionally left visible, historians have spent decades asking the same question. What exactly did he mean by it? At first glance, the phrase sounds almost like an argument, as if he wanted the world to believe he had been shaped by circumstances rather than personal choice, as if financial pressure, resentment, tax disputes, social frustration, and anger had gradually produced what happened on May 18, 1927. In that reading, the message becomes self-justification, a way of shifting blame outward, not denying what he had done, but implying he had become what others had forced him to become. And that interpretation fits much of what investigators already understood about him. For months before the bombing, Kehoe had grown increasingly hostile toward local decisions involving taxes and school funding. He believed the town's financial demands had damaged him personally. He believed others had created burdens he could not escape. He believed his losses were connected to decisions beyond his control. But many people experience debt. Many people lose elections. Many people feel bitterness toward institutions. Almost none build explosives beneath children. That is why the sign remains disturbing, because even if it reflects how he saw himself, it also exposes something darker, his attempt to place personal murder inside a larger theory. A theory where his violence becomes consequence rather than decision, and history rarely accepts that explanation, because whatever pressure he felt, the planning still required choices, hundreds of them. Buying materials, hiding explosives, testing access, timing the attack, murdering his wife, burning his farm, driving to the school, waiting until rescuers gathered, triggering the second explosion. None of that happened suddenly. Nothing about Bath was impulsive. The scale itself proves deliberation, which means the sign does not erase responsibility. If anything, it reveals how deeply he wanted responsibility interpreted differently. Some historians believe the phrase also reflected humiliation, because Kehoe's identity had been tied strongly to competence. He valued control, precision, order. He had a reputation for mechanical skill and strict personal standards, but his life had increasingly moved in directions he could not fully control. Debt increased. His farm weakened financially. His political defeat in local office mattered more emotionally than outsiders may first assume. To someone already rigid, repeated setbacks can begin to feel like public erosion, and in some personalities, humiliation hardens into grievance. The sign may therefore represent a final attempt to transform humiliation into narrative, to leave behind not merely destruction, but a sentence that suggested interpretation. A sentence forcing future observers to think about causation. And perhaps that is why it still unsettles modern readers, because the phrase almost invites debate while standing beside mass murder. Yet there is another reason the message remains unforgettable. It appeared next to one of the most carefully planned attacks in early American history. This was not written by someone whose violence lacked design. It came from a man who had already placed explosives beneath a school for months while greeting neighbors normally. That contrast makes the sentence feel colder. Words that sound reflective paired with actions that were devastatingly calculated. The town of Bath did not need the sign to understand guilt. The dead already answered that. 38 children, 6 adults, families destroyed, classrooms erased, a community permanently altered. No sentence could compete with that evidence. And yet the sentence endured because humans always search for explanation after horror. Especially when horror arrives from someone outwardly ordinary, that search never fully ends. Even now, nearly a century later, the sign remains one of the most quoted parts of the case because it condenses the discomfort of Bath into one line. How can someone appear functional while building catastrophe beneath ordinary life? And perhaps more importantly, how often do warning signs remain invisible because they do not look dramatic enough at the time? Neighbors had noticed irritation, harshness, conflict, but not a plan this large. No one imagined the school itself had become part of his grievance. No one imagined classrooms had already been transformed into targets. That is what makes Bath historically powerful even now. Not only the destruction, but the ordinary silence before it. The normal morning before the blast. Children arriving with books, teachers beginning attendance, parents moving through routine, all while a hidden design waited underneath them. And when history revisits Bath today, that hidden design often feels more frightening than the explosion itself, because explosions announce themselves. Preparation hides. The message Kehoe left behind therefore survives, not because it explains him fully, but because it fails to explain enough. It gives just enough language to disturb, but not enough to satisfy. It leaves motive partially visible and morally empty at the same time. Perhaps that is why Bath still matters. Because some tragedies resist neat explanation. They remain warnings precisely because explanation never fully resolves them. And long after national memory moved toward newer disasters, Bath remained the earliest proof that enormous violence can emerge from quiet resentment long before anyone believes the danger is real. The school was rebuilt, the town continued, generations returned to classrooms, memorials preserved names. But one truth remained fixed. On one spring morning in Michigan, ordinary life ended because one man decided that his private collapse should become public destruction. And history has never fully stopped asking why. If stories like this matter, it is because remembering forgotten tragedies protects them from becoming invisible twice, once in the moment, and once again through silence. So before you leave tonight, ask yourself, how many warnings do people ignore simply because they do not yet look dangerous? And if Bath had happened in the age of cameras, social media, and live broadcasts, would the world ever have forgotten it at all? If you want more forgotten dark history told in full detail, subscribe to Darkness Narrator, leave a like, and tell me in the comments, which forgotten case should be next? Because some stories disappear from headlines, but should never disappear from memory.